The most drunk guests Johnny Carson ever had. For 30 years, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television with a kind of effortless mastery that nobody before him had ever quite achieved and nobody after him has ever fully replicated. 5 nights a week, he walked out from behind that curtain, settled into his chair, adjusted his tie, and made the whole thing look easy. He could interview presidents and comedians, scientists and starlets, and somehow make every single one of them feel like the most interesting person in the room. He was, by any honest measure, the greatest talk show host who ever lived. But here's the thing about live television that the glossy highlight reels never quite capture. It is genuinely, fundamentally unpredictable. You can rehearse the questions, prep the guests, brief the producers, and time every segment down to the second. And then somebody walks through that curtain 3 sheets to the wind, and suddenly all of it goes straight out the window. Carson faced that reality more times than most people realize. The Tonight Show was not just a stage for Hollywood's finest moments. It was also, on more than a few memorable occasions, the place where Hollywood's finest arrived visibly intoxicated, fumbled through interviews, grabbed things off Johnny's desk, or simply forgot what planet they were on. What made those moments so fascinating was watching Carson navigate them. He was not just a host. He was a lifeguard, a traffic controller, and a diplomat all at once, smiling through the chaos and somehow keeping the whole thing from completely capsizing. Tonight, we're going to walk through the most memorable, most chaotic, and most genuinely shocking cases of drunk guests ever to sit across from Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. These are the stories that producers whispered about, that crew members never forgot, and that audiences still talk about decades later. Let us begin with the man who practically made drinking into a performance art form. Dean Martin built an entire second career on the image of the lovable, perpetually lubricated lounge singer who just happened to be one of the most talented entertainers alive. On his own variety show, it worked magnificently. The glass was always in his hand. The jokes were always slightly sideways, and the audience ate it up because the whole thing felt warm and controlled and deliberate. The Tonight Show was a different animal entirely. When Dean Martin appeared on Carson's couch, the carefully maintained illusion had a tendency to crack under the tighter format. Carson ran a structured interview. There were questions, there were setups, there were guests who needed their time and their moments. Dean, on certain evenings, arrived having already done considerable damage to whatever he was drinking backstage, and the results were something to behold. Carson would ask a question, and Dean would answer a completely different one, smiling broadly the whole time as though everything was going exactly according to plan. He mixed up the names of his own movies. He confused the other guests on the couch with people he apparently knew from entirely different contexts. On one occasion, he greeted Johnny with the warm enthusiasm of a man meeting a dear old friend for the very first time, despite the fact that they had known each other for decades. The audience laughed because the audience was trained to laugh at Dean Martin being Dean Martin, but after a few minutes a different feeling crept into the room. This was not the polished, winking performance from the variety show. This was something more unsteady, more real, and considerably harder to watch. Carson handled Dean with remarkable patience and genuine affection. He would toss him the softest possible setups, easy questions about familiar topics, anything Dean could field without too much mental navigation. Sometimes it worked. Dean would suddenly lock in, deliver a line with perfect timing, flash that million-dollar grin, and remind everyone in the room exactly why he was a legend. Then the next moment he would drift away again, losing the thread of a sentence halfway through, wandering toward the band with a vague expression like a man who had forgotten why he stood up in the first place. Producers learned over time to pad the schedule around Dean Martin appearances. Extra commercial breaks were quietly baked into the rundown. Backup segments were kept on standby. Because on a Dean Martin night, you genuinely never knew whether you were getting the icon or the man who had temporarily misplaced the icon somewhere between his dressing room and the guest chair. Ed McMahon was supposed to be the reliable one. That was the whole point of him. For 3 decades, he sat to Carson's right and provided the steady, predictable counterweight to whatever chaos might be unfolding around them. He laughed at the right moments, filled the dead air with grace, and anchored the show with the kind of dependable professionalism that you only truly appreciate when it suddenly and completely disappears. Which is precisely what made one particular Tonight Show broadcast so genuinely startling to everyone who witnessed it. The segment involved a recurring guest from the San Diego Zoo named Joan Embry, who had been bringing animals onto the show for years and was by that point something of a Tonight Show institution. It should have been a smooth, familiar, crowd-pleasing bit. Animals on the desk, Johnny playing along, audience delighted. Ed, however, arrived at his seat, having clearly spent some quality time with a bottle before the cameras went live. The trouble began almost immediately when Ed became intensely and inexplicably preoccupied with calculating exactly how many years Joan had been coming on the show. Was it 7, 8, 9? He was absolutely certain he was right, and he was absolutely wrong. And he argued the point with a conviction that only the genuinely intoxicated can summon for something so completely inconsequential. Carson tried gently redirecting him. Ed returned to the arithmetic. Carson tried again. Ed doubled down with renewed enthusiasm. When Joan finally began discussing the animals, Ed drifted into loosely connected stories about baby lions that meandered without resolution. His sentences started in one place and ended somewhere else entirely. Carson watched all of this with the expression of a man who had stepped onto what he thought was solid ground and felt it shift beneath his feet. He teased Ed gently, suggesting he might need a nap, trying to make light of it for the audience's sake. Ed oscillated between mild defensiveness and sudden, inexplicable sentimentality that had no obvious origin. It was not mean-spirited. It was not belligerent. It was simply Ed McMahon, the most reliable man in late-night television, visibly and undeniably not himself on national television. For anyone who had watched the show for years, it was deeply disorienting, like watching a lighthouse start to flicker during a storm. If Dean Martin and Ed McMahon represented uncomfortable television, what Truman Capote delivered in 1980 crossed the line from chaotic into something genuinely distressing, and nobody in the studio that night ever quite forgot it. Capote was one of the most celebrated literary figures in America. He had written works that defined their era and invented techniques that changed how nonfiction could be constructed. He was also, by the time of this appearance, deep in the grip of substance abuse problems that had already derailed his later career and were visibly consuming what remained. He could barely walk to the guest chair. The shuffle was pronounced, the balance uncertain. He steadied himself against Carson's desk before lowering himself into the seat, and when he finally settled, his eyes had that glassy, unfocused quality that told everyone in the room what they were dealing with before he had spoken a single word. Carson, who had seen his share of intoxicated guests over the years, recognized immediately that this was different in degree, if not entirely in kind. He offered a warm greeting, kept his tone deliberately light, and hoped for the best. It was worse than it looked. Capote slurred through nearly every sentence. Much of what he said was simply impossible to follow, the words blurring together into something that had the rhythm of speech without the content of it. The audience, which normally provided the warm and forgiving laughter that cushioned awkward moments on the show, fell into a kind of stunned quiet. Carson asked about his writing. Capote launched into a story about a party on the East Coast, something involving someone's dog, a narrative that doubled back on itself repeatedly and never arrived anywhere at all. Then, in a moment that people who witnessed it remember with particular vividness, Capote turned toward Ed McMahon with complete seriousness and asked if he could sit in his lap. Ed laughed the nervous laugh of a man who does not know what else to do. Carson redirected with the smooth efficiency of long practice. When Capote reached for a glass of water and missed his own mouth, the rim glancing off his chin and spilling down the front of his shirt while he remained entirely unaware of it, the audience fell completely silent. Not the amused silence of watching someone play drunk. The uncomfortable silence of watching something real and genuinely sad unfold under studio lights built for entertainment. Carson called the commercial break earlier than scheduled. They returned briefly, wrapped the segment with care, and Truman Capote shuffled back through the curtain. The invitation was never extended again. The clip has been discussed many times over the decades since, not because it is funny, but because it is an honest and painful document of a brilliant mind made unavailable to itself on national television. Shelley Winters was a two-time Academy Award winner, a genuine Hollywood legend, and on certain Tonight Show evenings, an absolute force of nature in the most challenging possible sense of that phrase. Her 1974 appearance has been described by people who were present as one of the most comprehensively chaotic single segments in the show's entire history. She arrived having been drinking, and she arrived in a mood most charitably described as uninhibited. From the moment she cleared the curtain, the conventional interview was effectively finished. Carson attempted questions. Winters answered different ones, at volume, at length, without apparent awareness that other people in the room might also have thoughts worth contributing. There were two other guests on the couch that evening, and they became furniture within minutes. Shelley Winters did not share a couch. She occupied one entirely and defended it without realizing she was doing so. The young actor present to promote his first major film had the particular misfortune of attracting her attention. In what was the most professionally damaging moment of the evening for someone other than Shelley herself, she turned to him, seized his knee with a grip that made him visibly flinch, and proceeded to dismantle his movie on national television. She called it boring. She described his performance as wooden. The young man sat with the frozen smile of someone attempting to survive a natural disaster through absolute stillness. Carson attempted to defend the actor. Shelley was not operating on a frequency that received such signals. Then came the note cards. Carson used prepared question cards written by the show's writers as a structural guide through interviews. They sat on his desk as they always did, unremarkable and invisible to the audience. Shelley Winters noticed them. Without particular ceremony or hesitation, she reached across, plucked the entire stack directly out of Carson's hand, and threw them over the back of the couch. Not placed them aside, threw them. The cards scattered across the studio floor. The audience gasped audibly. Carson sat for a long moment with the expression of a man genuinely processing what had just occurred. He had hosted decades of live television. Nobody had ever done that before. Winters continued talking as though nothing unusual had happened. Carson eventually looked directly into the camera with the expression of a man surrendering as gracefully as possible and announced the commercial break. The aftermath was swift and unambiguous. NBC producers communicated clearly to her representation that she was not welcome back. That prohibition held for nearly 3 years. When she eventually returned, the conversations that preceded her reappearance were, by multiple accounts, extremely direct about what was and was not acceptable behavior on the set of The Tonight Show. Orson Welles presented a particular variety of challenge because even at his most intoxicated, he remained more interesting than most guests at their most polished and prepared. He had consumed, by crew accounts, a substantial quantity of wine before his 1975 appearance, and he walked out looking like a man who knew precisely what he had done and was entirely at peace with every ounce of it. Carson asked his opening question. Welles began his answer. 14 uninterrupted minutes later, he was still going. It was not a ramble in the conventional sense. Welles moved through Shakespeare analysis that was genuinely insightful, the kind of observation that made you want to write it down, then veered into his own career, then into the broader history of theater, then into an anecdote about a Hungarian director whose name meant nothing to anyone in the studio. Carson sat with the patience of a man waiting for a train that operated on no published schedule. He would lean forward, open his mouth, and Welles would roll straight through the opening without pausing or acknowledging that someone else in the room existed. The Shakespeare quotation was a particular highlight. Welles began reciting from Hamlet, delivered 3 lines with tremendous authority, and then somewhere in the 4th line departed from the actual text, and began composing new lines that sounded authentically Shakespearean, but were entirely his own invention, delivered with precisely the same unshakable confidence as the real ones. Carson, who clearly noticed, chose not to intervene. The audience could not tell the difference. Welles possibly knew exactly what he was doing or possibly did not, and that ambiguity was itself a kind of accidental performance. The remarkable thing was that Carson kept inviting him back anyway, because even intoxicated Orson Welles was a spectacle genuinely worth watching. You simply had to accept in advance that the interview format would not apply, that you were getting instead something more like a private lecture from one of the most formidable minds in 20th century entertainment, delivered from somewhere deep inside a considerable quantity of wine. Peter O'Toole's 1978 Tonight Show appearance is remembered with particular fondness precisely because, unlike some others on this list, it was chaos with a pulse and an unmistakable sense of humor about itself. O'Toole arrived having spent the afternoon drinking, a fact apparently not subtle to anyone who encountered him backstage. He walked out with the electric, slightly tilted energy of a man running on talent and fermentation in roughly equal measure, and the audience sensed immediately that something unusual was coming. Carson asked about Lawrence of Arabia. O'Toole ignored the question with magnificent completeness and began an impassioned lecture on the philosophy of acting. It was, by multiple accounts, genuinely brilliant. It was also completely off topic. Then, mid-sentence, it dissolved into a confused digression that made no obvious sense before snapping back to brilliance again without warning. The oscillation was rapid and entirely unpredictable, and that unpredictability was its own form of riveting entertainment. He picked up Carson's pen from the desk and converted it without explanation into a fencing foil, proceeding to instruct Carson in a brief and entirely improvised fencing lesson right there on camera. Carson was laughing genuinely while simultaneously searching for any path back to a conventional interview. O'Toole was not offering one and appeared unaware that one was being sought. Then came the Richard Harris stories. O'Toole and Harris were famously among the great drinking companions of their generation, and the anecdotes O'Toole began sharing about their shared adventures were, judging by the visible discomfort of everyone around him, stories that had cleared nobody's publicist. Carson steered carefully. The audience roared. O'Toole finished one story, appeared briefly uncertain about where he was, and then launched directly into another one with refreshed enthusiasm. Carson brought him back repeatedly over the years because there was something about O'Toole's particular brand of chaos that never turned dark or mean. It was the overflow of a man with too much inside him rather than the unraveling of one who had lost the thread entirely. Robert Blake's Tonight Show appearances occupy a different and considerably harder register from the others on this list. Where Dean Martin was warm and fuzzy, and where O'Toole was charming and electric, Blake brought something harder-edged and more volatile to the couch. On the evening in question, multiple staff members noted backstage that he had been drinking before arrival, and the energy he carried through the curtain was not the loose, softened quality of someone who had simply taken the edge off a long day. It was something more coiled, more pressurized, more difficult to predict.